Erotic Lives of North American Beavers. Salvatore di Montferrat, Erotic Lives of North American Beavers. Field Notes on Credentialed Observers of Suburban Wildlife 1. A few weeks ago, on a downtown 1 train, a very hurried-looking graduate student in a Columbia sweatshirt sprang out of his seat at 116th Street, just as the doors were closing. In his haste, he left behind a stapled manuscript, heavily annotated in pencil, with a yellow sticky note on top that read, in a handwriting at once tiny and urgent, "Revise intro." I noticed it just late enough to make a useless lunge toward the closing doors, holding the thing up in a gesture that would have been noble had it not been so obviously futile. The train pulled away. He remained on the platform, briefly visible through the glass, patting his backpack with the dawning horror of a man who knows that his life is now divided into before draft and after draft. It seemed wrong to leave the paper where it was, and wronger still to read it. So, naturally, I did both things in sequence. My phone had just died with the moral suddenness peculiar to phones, and I was facing the prospect of another 20 minutes underground, with nothing to read, except the ads, which are, themselves, a kind of punishment. So I opened the manuscript, intending only to identify its owner. It was a field journal. More precisely, it was a field journal titled Seasonal Notes on Lodge Construction, Pair Bonding and Water Management in Castor Canadensis. I should say at once that there is nothing obscene in this title. I understand this now. At the time, however, alone on a train with a dead phone and an idle mind, I felt the first slight tremor of what I can only describe as semantic instability. There are certain lexical environments one approaches at one's peril. Pair bonding, lodge construction, water management. Even then, I did not yet suspect how badly things would deteriorate. The first page was innocent enough. Habitat conditions, riparian zones, seasonal shifts in timber preference, a paragraph on the structural role of mud in maintaining dam integrity. Then, only a page in, the student wrote, adult pairs displayed a sustained attachment to the occupied lodge, with repeated nocturnal activity centered around wood handling, bank work, and maintenance of the main entrance. At this point, I experienced a mild but unmistakable irritation, not with the student who had done nothing wrong, but with the English language, which had once again made itself available for purposes for which it was clearly not designed. I turned the page. In periods of persistent dampness, both members of the pair appeared highly responsive to changes in pressure and flow. Joint labor increased under saturated conditions, especially when breaches required immediate and intense plugging. There are moments in life when one would like to be a better man. This was one of them. I was not. I turned the page again. The male's technique for penetrating the bank was forceful, but controlled, with repeated withdrawal and re-entry to clear obstructing material. The female was typically observed nearby, processing woody matter with her incisors in what appeared to be a state of focused arousal. The footnote to this passage read, "Arousal here denotes heightened behavioral activation, not affective state." I found this clarification less helpful than intended. Entry to the primary lodge is achieved from below, through a submerged channel averaging 30 to 40 centimeters in diameter. When properly maintained, the animal can achieve full penetration of the entrance in under 4 seconds. There are sentences one reads once and cannot unread. This was one of them. I held the manuscript slightly away from my body as though distance might help. It did not. The male was reliably observed handling morning wood before other activities commenced, often for extended periods before turning his attention to the dam. I read this sentence 3 times. It did not improve. Both members of the bonded pair were then observed working in sustained alternation, one holding the timber in position while the other drove it home with repeated forceful strokes from below. This technique, while energetically costly, ensures deep and secure placement. By 72nd Street, I had accepted that I was going to finish the paper. The trouble, I soon realized, was not that the journal was improper. On the contrary, it was earnest, technical, and, for the most part, rather well observed. The trouble was that once the field had been prepared, once certain words had been placed too near, certain other words, the whole vocabulary became unreliable. Wood was no longer wood. Dampness was no longer dampness. Trunks, shafts, entry points, prolonged handling of branches, moisture retention, the careful packing of wet matter into vulnerable openings, none of these could now be trusted. And yet, whenever the author's notes approached anything having to do with the actual reproductive system of the animal, the prose underwent an immediate and astonishing collapse into bureaucratic lifelessness. Here, for example, is the entirety of one entry on mating season. Breeding occurs annually, typically during the winter period. Copulation takes place in water. Gestation lasts approximately 105 to 107 days. Litters vary in size. No unusual features were observed. That was it. No colour, no rhythm, no suggestiveness, no pleasure of any kind. It read like a tax form filed by an exhausted amphibian. My eyes slid off the page and sought refuge elsewhere, only to collide at once with the following passage, which began, "Oral processing of the shaft is typically initiated from the base, with the animal working upward in short, repetitive strokes until the desired diameter is achieved." This was about bark stripping. I knew it was about bark stripping. Knowing did not help. The student had also observed that the male was markedly vigorous in the evenings, that the female showed a strong preference for thick, dense members, and that both animals demonstrated an impressive capacity for sustained insertion and withdrawal over periods of several hours. He had written, with what I can only assume was complete sincerity, that the release of pressure, when it finally came, transformed the entire downstream environment. He had noted in the margin in pencil, underlined, beautiful. At a certain point, charity itself becomes difficult. One begins to suspect that weeks of solitary observation in wet terrain, devoted almost exclusively to bonded mammals, damp timber, and prolonged wood handling, may have produced in this otherwise diligent young man certain pressures for which the English language became an unwilling outlet. Or, as my wife, a Freudian-minded psychiatrist, would put it, the young man was sublimating himself all over the manuscript about beavers. This was a satisfying theory. It was also, I realized a moment later, exactly the wrong one. It located the obscenity in the student, which was just a more sophisticated way of locating it somewhere other than in me, the reader. I closed the manuscript at 42nd Street and looked out at the platform for a while. The obscenity was not in the beavers. It was not even in the manuscript. It was not, for that matter, in the student's presumed psychological condition, which I had just invented wholesale in order to have somewhere to put it. It was in the frame, in the sequence, the accumulation, the priming. The mind, once pushed into a certain channel, carries its own water. Put enough suggestive but innocent terms in proximity, and meaning begins to migrate. It abandons the places where, in theory, it belongs, and colonizes the surrounding terrain instead. The explicitly reproductive turns dry, administrative, dead on arrival. Everything else, timber, labor, dampness, pressure, entry, flow, becomes charged beyond its pay grade. And when the available terrain runs out, the mind simply reaches for the nearest graduate student and projects. This, I reluctantly recognized, is the same mechanism Borges isolates in Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote. Identical words encountered under a different description cease to be identical words. The frame is not neutral packaging. It is an active participant in the production of meaning. The reader does not passively receive language. The reader, primed and aimed, does a significant portion of the dirty work himself. Borges demonstrated this with Cervantes. A Columbia graduate student had demonstrated it with a beaver. I had just demonstrated it on the Columbia graduate student. With no particular reason to go to Columbia that day and no particular reason not to, I went the next morning. As any New Yorker knows, noble intentions become administrative errands with dispatch. I asked at the first desk where to return the manuscript and was sent to another building. There I was sent downstairs, then across a courtyard that smelled of old grant money and October, then through a corridor recently buffed to a menacing shine. Finally, someone glanced at the cover page, identified the department, and directed me toward a biology lab with the serene confidence of a person transferring liability. The lab door was partly open. From the corridor I could hear, before I could see, sounds of effortful physical labor, something rhythmic, punctuated by brief pauses, accompanied by low, urgent instruction. I pushed the door further and looked in. The student from the train was on the floor with a young woman in safety goggles. They were both flushed and breathing hard. Their hair was damp. They were very close together, their motions coordinated in the manner of two people who have been doing something physically demanding for a while and have found a rhythm. The young woman was on her hands and knees. The student was behind her, slightly to one side, one sleeve rolled above the elbow, his free hand braced against the wall. "Okay," she was saying, "push it in a little farther." "I'm trying. I can't get the angle." Here, hold on. Can you get underneath?" "If you just—" "Yes, hold it there. Hold it there." "I'm holding it. Don't let it slip." "I'm not letting it slip, just push." A pause. Then, "I need the mallet." She reached to one side and handed him a rubber mallet without looking up. I stood in the doorway for what I will describe as a professionally significant interval. The student looked up first. "Oh," he said, "that's my paper." I held it out to him. Between them on the floor was a long wooden plank. Another lay nearby. A third was propped against the lab bench. It turned out that, owing to a recent round of federal budget cuts, part of the lab floor had buckled, and the department had not yet convinced anyone in authority that undergraduate microbiology should not be conducted on a surface that flexed underfoot. So they were, in the most literal sense available to the English language, laying wood. "Thanks," he said, taking the manuscript with one hand, still crouched over the boards. "Sorry, we're trying to finish before facilities closes." I told him it was no trouble at all, which was almost entirely true. On the one train back downtown, now with nothing to read, I reflected that the erotic lives of North American beavers are, in all likelihood, not especially erotic. The same cannot be said for the words surrounding them, which under the wrong conditions, or perhaps the right ones, will do almost anything.